Good morning again. I'm here to introduce Christian Rothman. Mr. Rothman. Hello everyone. Before I begin my talk, I would like to show a short video clip. Can we get that on screen, please? And we can stop it there. Thank you. What you just saw was a video clip of our interpreting training program for deaf interpreters that was established in 2009 and has been running ever since. These are the topics that I'm going to be covering today. First, I want to talk about how our curriculum was developed and established and what's included in that curriculum. Then I will move on to talking about the state exam that deaf interpreters take for certification once they have completed the training and the process for that exam itself. I'll then talk about issues relating to professionalization of deaf interpreters. And finally, I'll conclude with further steps and what we are currently doing with this program. I'm going to be covering the experiences that we've had in establishing the program, and those experiences have led us to many questions. The questions that we see happening in our program in Germany are really the same kind of questions that you would see anywhere around the world in establishing this kind of standard, professionalism, and advanced training for deaf interpreters. So I believe that this applies to everyone. Moving on to the curriculum itself. The University of Hamburg has had programs in sign language and cultural studies and interpreting training programs for a long time. But those programs have never included deaf people training to become interpreters themselves. In 2008, we began our work there at the University of Hamburg, considering how we could establish a program that would be designed specifically for the needs of deaf people becoming professional working interpreters. As we were getting the program ready, we had to think about what resources we would need and how to transfer those resources into the program itself. We spent 2008 discussing what those different resources would be, what kind of information we would want to incorporate into the program, what the curriculum might look like, and gathering information from various programs that already existed around the world, here in the United States, in England, in Sweden, for example, gathering all of that information about what was happening with deaf interpreters. We also got information from WASLI, the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters, and gathered information that was on their website in order to incorporate all of that into our program development. As we established the program, we wanted to make sure that if we were training deaf people to become professionals, after they had completed the training, they would truly be recognized as certified professional interpreters. So we had to work closely with organizations in Germany that run professional interpreter certification programs for spoken languages in order to ensure that the certification test for deaf interpreters would be included as that same type of program. So their test was designed to test German and German Sign Language. They had that test for hearing interpreters already developed, and what we asked them to do was to add another test that could test German Sign Language and written German interpretation, German Sign Language interpretation into other signed languages from around the world, German Sign Language and international sign translation and interpretation, and they were making those adjustments to the tests to ensure that once people completed our training program, they would be able to be fully recognized as certified professional interpreters. So we were very cognizant of that and made sure that the timing was going to work out so that that would be in place by the time people completed our program. At the same time, we discussed working through the sign language interpreting agencies that were primarily designed for hearing interpreters. But we felt that the interpreting community as a whole was not ready for a deaf interpreting test for many reasons. So we went through the state levels and made it equivalent to translation tests for spoken languages. Now, the curriculum itself includes 10 courses, and I will list those courses here on the slides so you can take a look and see the types of courses that the students went through. The first course was Introduction to Interpreting and Translation, which was a survey of the field so that they could understand the way the field has worked up until this point and the theories that guide our work. We then had courses on cognitive processing, which was emphasizing memory skills and the mental skills required during the process of interpretation itself. Again, our goal is to train people to become professional interpreters, and that's going to require large stores in short-term memory, as well as the ability to repeat a message. So we trained our interpreters to be able to take in a source text up to 3 minutes long, and then be able to produce that as a consecutive interpretation. We want the deaf audience members to be able to perceive the same message that's coming from the source text. As we saw in the keynote this morning, there's a lot of implications behind what that source text is. We didn't want it to be just taking from the source text and putting that into a target text. We want the deaf interpreters to be able to contextualize on their own and produce a message that incorporates all of those different features. So we looked at text analysis. We looked at sight interpreting and sight translation, which means working from a written source message into a signed message. So it may be that there's a written text and they need to have a signed translation of that. It may be that there's text on a website and they want a signed video to go along with that text. So it involves reading the text and then making the choices in the production of the target text. So that's the sight interpreting and sight translation. We also had simultaneous interpreting courses. I had talked previously about the memory skills, so they had developed those skills and then were able to put them to use and trained in simultaneous interpretation so that a message coming live could be produced into the interpreted language and that they could do production in both ways in simultaneous interpretation. That's often used for assessments, and assessments and testing are a large role. Often there will be a large audience with a speaker at the front, but there may be various deaf audience members. So the target audience includes people who are strongly bilingual all the way to people who are strongly monolingual, meaning dependent upon the signed message entirely and not getting any of their meaning from the original written text. Then we also had courses on sign language linguistics, and again, it ties directly back to Dr. Jansen's presentation this morning, that it's not just about teaching phonology, morphology, syntax, but our understanding of what language is, how information is conveyed through language, how we receive it, and how we express it. So it was very important to include sociolinguistic information within that course as well, so that the students were exposed to language variation, variation based on age, region, ethnicity, etc., as well as being able to understand register and match register throughout all of their interpretations. It's a new process for me to have to wait for the slide to be shown, so I appreciate the cues here for me to pause each time. Thank you. We then had courses on ethics in the interpreting profession. And this is very, very critical. So this was a part of the training that was important for them to think about, to identify who they are and what they individually are bringing to the interpretation process. And that is not a small thing. That has an impact on all of the work we do, thinking about the ethics of the professionalism as a whole. We actually worked with the Canadian Interpreting Association because their code of ethics is very in-depth and includes lots of different areas, and we wanted to take that as our starting point and then work from there through discussions of different ethical situations to think about what may come up in your work as a professional deaf interpreter and what those issues may be, so that we could consider them in the classroom and then be able to apply them as working professionals. Of course, we included a course on international sign. And it was very interesting to stop and think about how to teach international sign, to think about what it means, to think about how iconicity plays a role, that the goal is not to be signing vocabulary from any specific assigned language, but rather trying to depict and show iconically many of those meanings. And that was a huge challenge to think about pedagogically how we were going to teach that, how we were going to design that course, so that interpreters would be ready to go out into the world and work from international sign into any of the various signed languages and vice versa. But we thought about calling it an iconicity course, but decided to go ahead and call it international sign, although there is a debate about that label, and I understand that debate. What we really were focusing on, however, was highly iconic language use. So how to move from a strongly vocabulary-based, specific to signed language into a much more iconic form of signing that's not based in any one specific nation's signed language. So people who go to events and use international sign may be international conference attendees, but they also may be people who have been isolated and not had access to a language growing up. So it may be users, immigrants, people who are learning the national sign language of the country that they just moved to. So any kind of use of strongly iconic signed language was included in that international sign class. Then we talked about translation sciences, which I think here more often is called interpreting theory. But the way that interpreting works, the theories that people have presented that relate to what the interpreting process entails, etc. We also had a course on the use of the teleprompter, and it's very interesting because it wasn't just text in a live situation that they were working off of a scrolling text like you would traditionally think of as a teleprompter text, but it was also text that the interpreters would prepare themselves. So it could be their notes, it could be their information, their restructuring of the text, whatever they wanted to visually have on that teleprompter rather than the source message text itself. And so we had training in how to use the teleprompter for those different strategies depending on what they were choosing to do at any given time. And we had a course on interpreting in teams. Interesting, as we were developing this program, we realized that there are so many different ways that people think of working in teams. Now we have to think about deaf interpreters as part of that team. So we had to think about training them on how to work in teams, but also teaching the hearing interpreters how to then work with these deaf professional interpreters as part of that team. So that's still a work in progress as well, to incorporate all of those different aspects of what teaming might mean. We also added a course in deafblind interpreting. And unfortunately, in Europe, the rights of deafblind people are not up to par with where they should be or with sighted deaf people. So we want to make sure that we are working in support of their rights and training interpreters to work with them specifically. With deaf interpreters, our training program was not designed to be teacher-centered, but rather student-centered. All of them had L1 sign language, so they were ready to participate in those discussions, ready to work through the theories. What we wanted to provide them with was the tools and resources they needed to be able to analyze their own language use, analyze the source languages and source texts that they were working with, and be effective as interpreters and translators. And we found that as they go through that training, that puts them in the best position to go out and work as professionals. We also included an internship portion of our program. We wanted the students to be able to go out and see interpreters working. At the same time, we didn't have a lot of opportunities because this was the first cohort coming through the program. There weren't professional deaf interpreters out in the community working. So we went ahead and sent them to work with professional interpreters that were working, hearing interpreters that were working, so that they could experience what that looks like, interact with those interpreters, and have that real-world experience to then build upon what they were learning in the classroom. So it was critical to us that they have that exposure to the community. And that was good feedback for them about how to analyze their own work and how to understand what was working and what was not. So the total is 960 hours for the full program, and then there's the internship component as well. So overall, they end up with over 1,000 hours of training, which includes contact time in the classroom, self-study, and internship experience. And we felt like that was a good quality level of training to give them. Of course, there are more things you could add to a curriculum. We could continue to discuss, and we are continuing to discuss amongst ourselves what we want, whether it's good enough, how to improve from here going forward. But we wanted to start with something concrete that we could move forward from, and that is what we chose. I just got a warning about time, so I'm going to try to move forward a little more quickly. I want to focus next on the state certification process itself. Again, the certification test itself was not part of the training program, but was run by a separate entity. This entity runs tests for interpreters and translators of various languages, and so they added our test to their system. There are two parts to their tests, one written portion and then a performance portion. The written portion also has two sections. It has an essay component, which for us was a signed essay. So it could be an essay that we came up with and signed related to interpreting theory, relating to interpreting practice. And then the second portion of the written test was a translation of a written text. Once the students passed that written portion, they could then move on to the performance portion of the test. That was actually testing their interpreting and translation skills. That portion of the test included 5 components. In the first portion, they're given a written text, which is typically a government-level text, typical of the court system or another government text, and they are asked to translate that text into the signed language. In the second portion, they're asked to do a translation from their L2 into their L1. In the third portion, vice versa, the L1 into the L2. The fourth portion is an interactive interpretation, where there is turn-taking happening and all of those other aspects of a dialogic interaction. And the fifth portion is a professional discussion, which can cover interpreting issues, interpreting theory, practices, knowledge of the agencies throughout the area, etc. Now, understand, the candidate must pass each and every one of those performance areas, and if at any point during the testing procedure they do not pass a component, they are not moving on to the next components of the test. And this is not something that was developed specifically for the deaf interpreters. Again, this is a testing system that's designed for interpreters and translators of various languages and is a state-level certification exam. And this test was designed to match with their design of the way tests are, just to be a signed language version of the test, specifically for deaf interpreters. It's important for the deaf interpreters going through the training program to understand who their various audiences will be when they are out working in the field. We wanted to make sure that the program was not designed specifically to teach to the test, but was teaching them to be professional interpreters. When they get to the point of taking the test, they can choose which their interpretation languages are going to be for that test, and then take the test and become certified. And once they are certified, it's a standard certification, and then they can be out in the world working as professionals on various different languages. We also wanted to make sure that this test was designed specifically for deaf interpreters. So it's not the same as the test that hearing interpreters take. It is a test that's designed specifically for interpreting and translation. So the test itself can be modified to any language combination, language A, language B, whatever those may be. The same testing procedures are used. And so the deaf interpreters go through that same test. So once they have achieved certification in that test, then they can go out and work in that language. So they can take the test using their L1 as one of their translation languages, and the exam was designed to do that. Unfortunately, I'm now being told that my time has run out. There is so much more information. I wish I could have gotten to the issues that we discovered, but I'm very happy to have had this chance and opportunity to share with you what we've been doing. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much.
Great. I was taking a look around the room trying to find my presenters, and I have found one. If you are ready to begin. All right, so please come on up. Our next presenter is a group of three. We have Dr. Melanie Metzger, Dr. Stephen Collins, and Earl Fleetwood. I will turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. First, I have some unfortunate news to share with you. Dr. Stephen Collins is not able to be here today. He is ill, and very unfortunate that he has to miss the first day of the symposium. The three of us have worked together for a number of years now looking at this particular topic, examining what it is that interpreters bring and how they generate utterances within a particular interpreted context. And we've looked at this issue from a variety of different perspectives. So we had hoped to, together, present this information to you today. From Bordeaux's research, we can see very clearly that the work of deaf interpreters has been increasing over the number of years. Also, the interpreter working right now, Carolyn Ressler, has conducted research as well on deaf hearing interpreting teams. That, along with Dr. Stephen Collins' work, looking exactly what happens with deaf interpreters working in tactile deaf-blind situations, and Stone's work, looking at the use of deaf interpreters in media in European countries. So through this variety of research, we can come to understand the kinds of work that's done by deaf interpreters. Today we'll be looking specifically at deaf interpreters, one particular case that has been researched where a deaf-blind consumer is utilizing tactile interpreting services, although tactile interpreting services modified somewhat because this individual does have some residual vision. So not an actual example of tactile, but a modified version. But before we move to that example, and let me pause a moment for the camera. Thanks for that cue. Before we move to that, I think it's important to understand the perspective we use as we analyze this work. Of course, for a number of years in our profession, we've had this notion that interpreters are neutral, and from the keynote today, we clearly have come to understand that that's not the case at all. So what does that mean for interpreters? We in our profession know that language is very complex, and it's very difficult to really separate language and meaning and culture. So how is it that interpreters are able to function given that? Research suggests that interpreters are co-participants in the language mediation process, and again, that was part of the keynote today. Our specific focus is on exactly how interpreters co-participate in that process. So as I am actively interpreting, do I generate text that's from my own personal experience? Of course, I don't think that's exactly what we mean by co-participant, but exactly what do we mean? What range and at what level can interpreters participate in an interpreted interaction? Research to date does indicate that interpreters, in the act of translating and interpreting, do generate utterances. When we do contribute or generate utterances in such a way, these utterances function in a couple of different ways. One of the functions relates to my ability to function in relaying information or translating that information, and another type of utterance relates to interactional management. The three of us, as well as other researchers, have come to understand that language modality does in fact have an impact on interpreter-generated utterances. Discourse genre also, as we have come to understand, has an impact on these utterances. If we look at a variety of different contexts, be it a medical situation or a doctor's office or an educational setting, each of these discourse genres impact the kinds of utterances. So interpreter-generated utterances can come in two different forms, one of them being the relaying forms has been discussed, and there are different types of utterances that fall within this particular category. The first one being source attributions. It might be the case that an interpreter needs to identify who the producer of that source language is. If there are just two individuals engaged in a conversation, the interpreter is fairly easy able to represent who is actually initiating that comment, be it the interpreter generating that, or a deaf person, or the hearing person. Attribution is a way of our identifying exactly who is generating the source. Secondly, in this category is repetition. There are times when interpreters may add repetition as a tool of their interpreting, not necessarily as part of the source, but rather generated by the interpreter. And if I can think of an example, perhaps if the deaf person looks away from the interpreter and misses what the interpreter has just said or what has been spoken, the interpreter may repeat that information. Again, the information would be lost if the interpreter did not repeat it for the consumer. Third is request for clarification. And again, through research, evidence indicates that interpreters do request for clarification if the information is ambiguous, or if, let's say, the interpreter maybe perhaps isn't from the local area, not from the D.C. area, and they see a specific area of town indicated that's particular to Washington, D.C., let's say Georgetown. And maybe if you're not from that particular area, you may have to ask for clarification of the producer of that to better understand how to produce the source or the target message. So the interpreter is requesting information to help them provide an accurate interpretation. And last in this category is explanations. Interpreters do add information as a way to provide an explanation to the source message. Let's think, for example, if you're in a doctor's office and the nurse is outside of the room and knocks on the patient's door. The interpreter at this point would indicate to the deaf patient that someone is knocking on the door. That's an example of an explanation that, should it not be done, would leave something missing from the exchange. So relaying that information would be critical for the people involved to both have equal access. Someone knocking on the door isn't any kind of spoken utterance, but rather it is part of what needs to be relayed to the deaf patient. And so we see that as being an example of an explanation. Now moving to the other category of interpreter-generated utterances, the interactional management, there are 4 different types. The first one being introductions. Sometimes, although not always, interpreters will introduce themselves. They may ask if the consumer has worked with interpreters before and perhaps provide a bit of an explanation about what they do and what their role is. Without doing so, it can create kind of an awkward experience, and we've seen that to be very much the case. Secondly, consumers may ask questions directly of the interpreter, and those questions could be simple as, how did you learn to sign, or how do you sign a particular word, to other more personal kinds of questions. The interpreter has certain options. They can simply ignore the question, and data shows that is one response that interpreters have to these questions directed to them, or they might approach it in a different way. But either way, it does impact the interaction. The response of the interpreter shows a way that they are engaging in the interaction, managing the interaction. No response could result in some disruption to the interpreted event, as would a lengthy response to the question. So there are a number of different ways the interpreters can manage this kind of interaction, and certainly more research could be done in this particular area. Thirdly is interference. By interference, we're talking about something the interpreter says or does that causes the situation to be disrupted in some way. So the interpreter, let's say, is signing and accidentally, in signing, bumps into the person next to them and apologizes for that. So that's just an example of what an interference might be. And then lastly in this category, we have summonses. This might be if it's somewhat related to identifying the source of an utterance. If I think about an interpreter who's working with two individuals, one being hearing, one being deaf, and the deaf person is not looking up when the hearing person begins to speak, the interpreter will often get the attention of the deaf person to indicate the person is speaking. So that's an example of a summons. It relates to how individuals know when to take turns. And interpreters will be able to add information to help individuals understand who's speaking and when they need to attend to that information. For this particular research study, we have chosen a videotape that was produced back in 1992. This was produced by Teresa Smith, and she was producing this videotape to introduce people to the deafblind community. It's a panel discussion with a number of individuals being filmed. There is a deafblind close vision participant on the panel. Another person is the deaf interpreter, and that's the work we looked at for this particular study. Teresa Smith, who is a hearing individual who's asking questions of the panelists, as well as another deafblind individual using tactile interpreting, and a hearing interpreter. We looked predominantly at the deaf interpreter and their work with the close vision participant who is on the panel. As has been demonstrated in previous research, we see the same kinds of generated utterances from the interpreter being evidenced in the deaf interpreter's work. Interesting, though, if you look at the one category of explanations, I wanted to focus a bit on that particular topic today. Hello, everyone. Dr. Metzger has just talked about different ways of relaying that interpreters do, and I wanted to talk particularly about one that relates to explanations. Imagine if you enter a room where there are a number of individuals, some being deaf, some hearing, deaf-blind people, and you as an interpreter. You have a goal of making sure that the information that is being delivered by the sender of the message is received similarly by the receiver of the message, ensuring that meaning is translated between languages for individuals involved. But there's something more to the work than just what I've described. The equivalence is not just about making sure that message equivalence is attained by both the sender and the receiver, making sure that everyone understands exactly what was being communicated. But beyond that, it's also understanding who is generating that information and where it is they're located in relation to you as the receiver of that information. So think about how that might apply to an individual using tactile sign language. How it is the interpreter would ensure that equal participation can be experienced by the person through tactile interpreters. So the first thing, upon entering this kind of environment, it would be important for the interpreter to indicate who is in the room and where these individuals are located, and share that information with the individual who is using close vision interpreting services or who is deafblind, so that that person is able to understand who is sharing information, where is it they're located in relationship to themselves, and also what it is that they're saying. So it's through those means that equal access to communication can be achieved. We analyzed data from a videotape, and I wanted to show you a sample of that here. If you direct your attention to one half, the left half of the screen, you'll be able to see the work of the deaf interpreter that we analyzed. So in this clip, you saw an example of the interpreter not just capturing the message of what was being said, but also making sure the expressed message was understood in relation to who was generating that and where they were sitting. So the interpreter is able to communicate information about where individuals are located and who those individuals are to ensure that information is equally accessed by everyone. You just saw one example of how an interpreter would provide an explanation to ensure the interpretation process is done accurately, and it's a good example of that very thing that we mentioned earlier. Also, we talked about the other kind of generated utterances by interpreters, those being interactional management. While I could go into each of these, I wanted to mention something peculiar, something very new that had not been seen before in the particular clip that we analyzed. At the very beginning of that interaction, we saw the interpreter wanting to engage in a discussion about logistics. Again, as I mentioned, the particular consumer the interpreter was working with did have some ability to see, and the interpreter was gauging whether or not that individual wanted them to continue to sign while they were not looking, or only sign when they got the eye gaze of the consumer. So from my experience as an interpreter, that's something that's very important, that we understand the logistics of the setting. But this is the first time we've seen this sort of thing captured on film in this particular clip, and I'll show you that now. What you see in this clip, the deaf interpreter has initiated a dialogue with the consumer, asking as to how they would like the interpreter to work. So if we look at both the explanation and the discussion of logistics, we can see very clearly that deaf interpreters engage as well in the communication exchange. In this particular case, the deaf interpreter is doing so to ensure that access to information is delivered for that deaf-blind individual. And again, that speaks to the notion of both mode and the genre impacting the kind of utterances. So you see the numbers totaled here, as well as the addition of the new category, discussing logistics. So as we see, deaf interpreters, as every other interpreter, do generate utterances while actively interpreting. There are some variations in terms of how information can be delivered based on the kind of accessibility that's being provided to the deafblind participant, whether it's a standard tactile approach or whether it's a modified tactile approach. But nonetheless, the interpreter does engage in interactional kinds of discussions to ensure communication is accessible. We did identify this additional category of logistical management that's added to the list that we previously had. There may be others that other researchers identify in further research. I guess that's it.
And thank you so much. And we actually have a few minutes. If there are any questions from the audience, please come up and pose your questions from in front. Any questions from the audience? We do have someone. If you wouldn't mind coming up, please. I just have a brief question, if you wouldn't mind going back to the slide, or it seems as if there's another PowerPoint already up. But in the information that you have about the data, I wanted to know, you said 23% were responses to questions, and who was the one that was asking the questions?
That's an excellent question. You know, one of the very fascinating things about this data that we came to realize was because of the way the panel was situated, we had two different ways that interpreting was being provided. The interpreter was there as a interpreter, but at the same time was also had the role as part of a panelist. So, again, this was a commercial videotape, so we could ask specifically how all four of them were able to respond to questions that were asked by the moderator. And as you can see, that's why there were so many instances of the interpreter responding to questions.
Any other questions from the audience? Thank you so much, Dr. Metzger.
Certainly, and thank you.
Please prepare the next PowerPoint. We have a few minutes. I just want to make sure that the lighting is correct. The lighting is good. We have about 3 minutes left, so please wait before beginning your presentation. 2 minutes before we begin.
I'd like to introduce our next presenter. This is Mark Zorov. Mark?
Thank you so much, and thank you all for attending my conference. I'm so fortunate to be able to come and present at this symposium. In Germany, there have been some flight cancellations because of some protests that were happening here, so thank God I was able to come and arrive here safely. Obviously, it's a huge honor for me to be here at this first international symposium regarding the field of interpreting. As a historian, I have been doing researching regarding deaf history and deaf Jewish history, and that's throughout my lifetime, and now I'm able to focus on the field of interpreting as well. So we're going to focus on deaf sign language interpreters, and we utilize the term deaf sign language interpreters because we want to focus on the language and on the work of interpreting and not on the sensory experience of the person who is doing the interpreting. Just one moment. Obviously, I want to be able to introduce to you who our deaf state interpreters are. We're going to talk about the professional organizations that credential deaf sign language interpreters. As Dr. Rothman already introduced to you, our curriculum that is being done at the University of Hamburg. We'll also talk a little bit about that. And in addition to that, experiences and research questions that have arose and the results of those questions being answered by means of research. We don't have everyone present in this picture, but we do have 11 of our state certified deaf sign language interpreters. These are the first group of deaf sign language interpreters who have been certified in our country. So if you come to Germany as a visitor, you know who to meet and you know who to request for services. There are hearing sign language interpreter organizations. Some of these deaf sign language interpreters are already members of these professional organizations. However, there is a paradigm shift in the way that hearing and deaf interpreters are working together. So, for instance, here in the United States of America, you have the continuing education units and the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf that maintain certification. But at this point, because of the paradigm shift that's happening, the organizations that were mainly focused on hearing sign language interpreters now have to be able to involve deaf sign language interpreters in certification, maintenance, and also in credentialing. And it's also important for them to be able to collaborate and for us to be able to share resources. And we wanted to be able to establish our own organization to be able to credential us as well. And this is a new internet website that has been set up for persons to be able to contact us as deaf sign language interpreters. As you can see here, the page name is tgsd.de. And here all the information is housed regarding any news or updates about our work. Deaf and hearing sign language interpreters have the same rights and obligations and also have to follow the same ethical principles as professionals working in the field. It should not be that deaf persons have less expectations of them because of them being deaf. Obviously, it's also a change for the deaf community. They're not used to working with deaf sign language interpreters, but over time we want to be able to interact with the community and orient them as to the use and potential for utilizing deaf interpreters and how they can utilize deaf interpreters the same way that they utilize hearing sign language interpreters. Obviously, these changes are very dynamic and are occurring quickly. Germany has the hearing sign language interpreter organizations that are working towards incorporating deaf sign language interpreter members, and that's in process right now. As was presented this morning, the University of Hamburg was working in cooperation with the Academy of Continuing Education that did a study over a year and a half regarding the completion of this deaf sign language interpreter training program. After the interpreters go through their 2-year training, they go to the Department of Darmstadt, which is the Department for Teacher Education in Germany, in order to be credentialed. Deaf sign language interpreters will have to demonstrate competency in at least 2 working sign languages, be it written German or German Sign Language, or other peers could be German Sign Language, International Sign, or German Sign Language and American Sign Language, or even German Sign Language and Australian Sign Language. They would be able to meet the needs of any of the deaf consumers that they serve. They also have to demonstrate competency in a variety of interpreting techniques, including simultaneous and consecutive interpreting, and communicating about the profession on an ethical basis. Obviously, key to the interpreting process is having a very strong working memory. So being able to take in information, process it, and retain it, and be able to take that information from the source language, process it, put it into the hearing language. So it's important for them to have a very skilled working memory to be able to retain and put out information. So it's important that they have that training. They also need to have knowledge of linguistics and interpreting theories to be able to be clear about their work and transmitting the message accurately. They also have to do observation, training, and mentorships so that they understand what the role of themselves as interpreters are. Next slide, please. We have a variety of target populations that we, as deaf sign language interpreters, would serve. We have what's known as barrier-free communication that is provided via internet website pages where videos in German Sign Language are provided. So as you know, most websites have written text, but we would provide that barrier-free communication in sign language for German citizens. We also provide sign language interpretation for visitors from other countries, such as American Sign Language or whatever their national sign language is. There are also immigrants who migrate to the country who have no competency in German Sign Language, or perhaps persons who need more iconicity in the language production. So a sign language interpreter who is adept in international sign would be able to provide equal access for them. I'm not sure on the terminology that you utilize, but for persons who have perhaps mental delays or mental disorders, who need perhaps more visual communication, we also want our interpreters to be adept in being able to provide communication for them as well, with more iconicity. These are the different areas in which deaf sign language interpreters can work, just as here in the United States, government offices, medical situations, legal situations, which include law enforcement, even in the educational system, where perhaps you have a deaf student who is mainstreamed in a public school system. They would be able to have a deaf sign language interpreter provide language modeling and language clarity for them. So being able to work with hearing and deaf sign language interpreter pairs to provide that service. Other areas would be, for instance, television, regional programs, international events, and so on. Other examples are text site translation. Sometimes the government will send letters to their citizens that need to be translated into German Sign Language, and those services can be provided as well. After a year of going through the credentialing process, we have been able to come up with research questions related to the experiences of our deaf sign language interpreters. So the question that we're posing is, how did it look so far after those 2 years for the deaf sign language interpreters and in the different areas that they've worked in? Germany has 16 states who are under one federal government. And on these government websites, they provide sign language videos for explanation of different services that are provided from the government. So obviously, these websites usually provide information in German and English, and to provide barrier-free access, they are also providing it in German Sign Language. And because of the recognition of German Sign Language as an official language in Germany, these services must be provided by law. The question is, however, what's the exact percentage of how much access is provided, whether or not it's 100% barrier-free access or if there's a range on that. So that's what we're focusing on as well. Let's say, for instance, there are students who want to be able to have access to information and to education, to be able to have access to audio and video and sign language. There's a special program that's called Verba Voice, where sign language interpreters are provided, providing access to whatever audio or video is online. This is another area of work for deaf sign language interpreters. For international conferences, for instance, for the international organization UNESCO, or for other non-governmental organizations, even for the United Nations, in being able to provide barrier-free access for our deaf German citizens. the way that this would work is that, let's say this international conference is taking place in Vienna, I would be provided with remote access from my home and would have access to the information via captioning. There would be 2 interpreters that will be working together in providing access to the information. And then in Vienna, on the screens or monitors, the interpreters would be displayed, and all of the persons who are there in the audience would be provided with access. It's not necessary for the deaf sign language interpreter to be there in person. They can provide this service remotely. As I mentioned, Germany has 16 states. Each of these states have their parliament. Just as here you have your political parties, Democrats and Republican. We also have our parliament process where, they want to talk about politics all day long and debate the laws and so on. And so we want to provide access to our deaf German citizens so that they can be able to know what's happening and learn about the political system. And, as an interpreter, I try to remain neutral. I don't want to get too involved in the politics of everything. As in America, before the elections, you have your convention parties to rally your troops, so to speak. In Germany, we also have those types of rallies. In May, there's going to be a European Union vote that's going to come into play because we have a proportional system as to our political parties. So we have someone here who's actually being elected into Parliament. Again, here providing access to our deaf citizens so that they can have a window into what's happening in the political system in Germany. The positive impact of having all of this access broadcasted to the larger community is that obviously everyone wants to be aware of the news and what's happening in the world and current events. What would happen is that persons who are out in the community would be able to see that sign language interpreting is being provided, and that allows the larger community to be aware of the services for our deaf citizens. That's not the correct slide. Could you move on to the next one, please? If you can move on to the next slide. Yes, that's the one. Thank you. So I wanted to show you the working languages of our deaf sign language interpreters, how they work from written to signed languages, and we spoke about that already. There's a new initiative that's happening in the government where deaf people will be able to have access to current information and actually question or query the government about issues. There is already that service for hearing constituents. The service that's now being provided for deaf constituents is that they will actually be able to write an email that will be sent to a deaf sign language interpreter, and that deaf sign language interpreter would be able to pose the question to the government agency and then receive the information back and translate that into German Sign Language for the deaf constituent. This is called SQAT, the Sign-in Question Answer Tool, which is funded for by the government. The deaf person does not have to pay for the service. And again, this is providing that barrier-free communication access to governmental agencies for the deaf constituents. The issue is not regarding literacy in a written language or a spoken language such as German. The point is that since German Sign Language is officially recognized, that the government has to provide this service in a language that is accessible to its constituents. This digital plaque is a culmination of my life's work as a historian, interpreter, and a member of the deaf Jewish community. This is a memorial for deaf Jewish Holocaust survivors in Berlin. Obviously, we have the Holocaust Memorial for hearing survivors. And we really wanted to have a public display to show the history of deaf Jewish Holocaust survivors. The information is usually when these types of plaques are established, they would only put them in written English and written German. However, now it's being provided in German Sign Language and in International Sign. And again, this is not something that's within a museum. It's outside in public so that everyone would have access to the information. The United Nations Convention for Rights for Persons with Disabilities encourages that type of equal access. And since Germany has ratified that, we wanted to make sure that this memorial was there for the victims of the Holocaust. The results of the work that we have done and the implications is that the sky's the limit as far as job opportunities for deaf sign language interpreters. And again, because now we're in the media, that is fantastic and that is continuing in development. And that allows for deaf pride within the deaf community, and in addition to that, public awareness for the majority of German citizens. Also, we notice that there is a power shift within the interpreting profession where there is more equality as far as deaf and hearing sign language interpreters are concerned. And since I am now credentialed as a sign language interpreter, I can work in the legal system. And sometimes when I come into these work arenas, people are taken aback by the fact that I'm a deaf sign language interpreter. But it is my opportunity to give them an orientation about the work that we can do, and also give them an orientation about the work that we can do in conjunction with hearing sign language interpreters. So obviously there is one of the language periods that we do work in is written German. So we do that type of work within the legal system as well. And I have finished with that slide. If you wouldn't mind to go on to the next one. I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from the audience? Great, if you could come on up. Many questions, and I'm trying to narrow it down to just one specific thing. So you have this training program for deaf interpreters, and then they work. Oh, so you're not teaching in the program, but the deaf interpreters go through the program, and then they go out and work. Then when they're working with hearing interpreters, do those hearing interpreters have any training on how to work with the deaf interpreters? So that was my first question. And then secondly, I'm curious about how the hearing interpreters feel about deaf interpreters getting that kind of training. Here in the United States, we often see hearing interpreters somehow threatened by the presence of a deaf interpreter on the job with them. So I'm curious in Germany whether you're having that same kind of experience, or what the emotional response of the hearing interpreters has been to seeing deaf interpreters professionalized.
Great question. Great question. I'm sorry about the delay. I'm not used to the turn taking. We have team interpreting that is taking place in different arenas, and obviously we need to have a good working relationship with our hearing colleagues. And so I feel that it should be part of continuing education and providing workshops and trainings for hearing sign language interpreters as to how we could improve that working relationship. So that's something that's in progress. Obviously, it's important for us to have mutual respect. And you are correct that many times there is some territorialism that can happen with hearing sign language interpreters, and we see some reticence in them wanting to work with us, just as here in the United States it's happening. We are, however, working and making progress. We have the hearing interpreter organization right now actually has a deaf president, so we see that we are making progress in that sense. And it's really revolutionary what's happening in our field at this point.
I think we have time for one more question if you want to come on up. This is fantastic to be able to see this. I am not yet a certified interpreter, but I'm aiming towards that. You talked about the federal government funding the different interpretation and translations that are available for people. And I'm curious which department of the federal government that's coming from. Is it coming from Department of Health, Department of Languages, any of those?
As far as conferences are concerned, I'm not sure about who does the financing because, I'm hired as the interpreter. However, for the questioning tool that I spoke about, the funding is allocated by the government. I don't know exactly what agency it is, and I don't want to speak out of turn or in error. So it could come from a variety of resources. Tomorrow I have another presentation about working with deaf constituents and funding and allocation and so on. So perhaps you could attend that and be able to get some more questions answered.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's have another round of applause for our presenter. Thank you very, very much. And our session is completed.